Und kannst du auch zufällig, du siehst ja irgendwie die fortschreitende Zeit bei der Aufnahme. Kannst du
Ja,
da den Time-Marker aufschreiben, wann der Talk beginnt, also wann die Präsentation beginnt?
sicher, werde ich machen. Also wird wohl in 22 Minuten sein. Mal schauen.
Okay. So, wen haben wir denn jetzt hier noch vom engeren Kreis? Melkan, hi.
Moin, moin.
So, wir sind hier gerade mal an unserer Agenda, die wir jetzt nochmal eben durchjagen wollen, bis um 21:30 dann Sai anfängt, ähm, uns die Make-Your-Law Org-Geschichte zu erklären. Und Top 1 haben wir jetzt mehr oder weniger schon abgehandelt. Genau, Slash, ich habe es unten schon unter To-Dos und Beschluss habe ich schon reingeschrieben bei Top 1 zu Top 1.
Also ich denke, also so extrem eilt das ja nun auch nicht. Und an Betracht der leider nicht stehen bleibenden Zeit, würde ich vorschlagen, dass wir dann auch mit dem Top 2 weitermachen und das mit der Abstimmung, das werden wir halt im Verlauf der Woche durchführen, würde ich sagen. Auch gerade weil wir jetzt nicht so zahlreich sind hier.
Genau. Jo, dann lasst uns weiter zu Top 2 Grundidee. Da gibt's nochmal einen überarbeiteten Text von Wolfgang und Daniel. Das würde ich allerdings auch vorschlagen, dass sich das jeder nochmal in Ruhe nächste Woche durchliest. Und wir sollten jetzt nur festlegen, weil ich bin zeitlich nicht dazu gekommen, meine Hausaufgaben vom letzten Mal zu machen und den Text, den wir haben, schon ins Wiki zu übernehmen. Was wir jetzt eben kurz abstimmen sollten, ist, ob ich jetzt den jetzigen Text, wie wir ihn abgestimmt haben, übernehmen soll oder ob ich noch warten soll. Also letztes Mal haben wir eigentlich gestimmt, dass wir es übernehmen sollen. Ich bin nur zeitlich nicht dazu gekommen. Die Frage ist jetzt, bleibt es bei dem Auftrag oder ändern wir das?
Also meinerseits würde ich ja sagen, weil das ist Consent und da ist jetzt auch dieser eine Zwischensatz vom letzten Mal ist mittlerweile ergänzt und ja, wie sehen die anderen das?
Also ehrlich gesagt, jedes Mal, wenn man drüber schaut, fällt einem natürlich noch was ein. Und ich halte es also nicht für sinnvoll, jetzt noch mal kurz zu warten. Lieber erst jetzt reinstellen und dann vielleicht in einem Monat oder ein Vierteljahr, wenn es sein muss, dann noch mal dran gehen. Aber jetzt ins Wiki stellen, fände ich schon erstmal geeignet.
Herr Wolfgang, es geht jetzt um den alten Text, ne, um die neue Variante, an der du, glaube ich, mitgearbeitet hast.
Ach so.
Ja, weil jetzt wieder alle nicht den neuen Text wahrscheinlich gelesen haben und der alte Text ja schon Konsens ist, der neue Text noch nicht. Und die Frage ist jetzt, gucken wir noch, ob der neue Text Konsens wird oder hauen wir den alten einfach jetzt schon ins Wiki?
Also ich wäre dafür, weil es Konsens war, den auch reinzustellen. Na, die Frage ist nur, was das jetzt für eine Arbeit macht. Und wenn wir in einer Woche den neuen dann abnicken, wäre es vielleicht schade, um die Arbeit den reinzustellen. Aber so viel ist es ja, so schlimm ist es ja auch wieder nicht, ne?
Nee, ich muss halt nur einfach mal eine Viertelstunde finden, um das zu tun, aber die hatte ich halt irgendwie letzte Woche nicht und ich wäre auch dafür, das zu machen, dass ich jetzt erstmal den abgenickten Text, den wir als Konsens schon haben, dass ich den erstmal reinstelle und dann machen wir sukzessive Überarbeitungen und hangeln uns dann so vor.
Auch da würde ich dann doch als mittlerweile Engagierter vorschlagen, guckt euch nochmal die neue Form an. Ich finde, es ist für Außenstehende auf jeden Fall besser lesbar durch diese Zwischenüberschriften. Und dann kannst du ja, Marc, das Ende der Woche ins Wiki stellen, wenn bis dahin keine wesentlichen Einwände gekommen sind. Aber ich glaube, dieser neue Entwurf, der ist ja inhaltlich auch weitestgehend identisch mit dem ersten. Ja, der stellt schon für Außenstehende eine wesentlich günstigere Fassung dar.
Okay, dann mache ich dazu auch nochmal ein Doodle und dann dudeln wir das bis Donnerstag und dann gucken wir, wie das Ergebnis ist.
Ich möchte dazu anmerken, dass ich heute mal drüber geguckt habe über die neue Version, wenn das die ist, die unten an der alten Version dranhängt, und habe auch mein Senf dazu gegeben. Also ich habe verschiedene Sachen nochmal, ich habe einfach Alternativen an manchen Stellen eingefügt, wie wir das auch bei den Begriffsdefinitionen da gehandhabt haben, und habe versucht, das Ganze noch ein kleines bisschen kürzer zu machen, ein kleines bisschen, ja, kürzer, einfach klarer. Ähm, hm, keine Ahnung. Könnt ihr euch auch mal angucken.
Ja, dafür habe ich volles Verständnis. Ich hatte ja auch mit Daniel noch die Diskussion, dass tatsächlich unsere Form gewisse Redundanzen enthält. Aber wir hatten sie dann doch erstmal aus der Hand gegeben. Also wenn es da Interesse gibt, die Redundanzen zu beseitigen, da bin ich natürlich auch leicht zu überreden.
Ja, okay, das dauert dann aber alles und den anderen Text, den haben wir schon. Also ich würde sagen, wir machen es so, ich setze nochmal ein Doodle auf und dann gucken wir bis Donnerstag dieser Woche und wer dann halt seine Stimme dazu abgibt und dann gucken wir, wie das Ergebnis ist und dann setzen wir das um.
Genau.
Ja.
Gut.
So, Slash, was hast du denn jetzt da in Zeile 39 geschrieben? Da komme ich jetzt nicht mit klar.
Ja, es bietet sich ja an, dass wir unseren Grundidee-Text auch ins Englische übersetzen und das muss auch heute noch getan werden.
Jo, das stimmt wohl. Jo, aber das lass uns erstmal hinten anschieben, oder?
Okay.
Also meine Motivation, das jetzt zu machen, wäre ein bisschen lau, solange wir noch nicht eine endgültige Fassung haben. Also wenn das jetzt sich gerade noch weiterentwickelt so, dann lass uns da warten, bis das ein bisschen sich gesetzt hat, oder?
Ja, ich würde dann schon sagen, die Wiki-Version, die können wir dann ruhig auch übersetzen, weil das, was wir dann ins Wiki stellen, das ist dann erstmal ja, mittelfristig stabil, will ich mal sagen. Und das lohnt sich dann schon, das zu übersetzen. Und die neueren Versionen, da müssen wir dann halt gucken, wie wir das machen.
Also das heißt, der Top 2 kann doch so bleiben, dass irgendjemand jetzt sich den Hut aufsetzt, um eine englische Übersetzung zu machen?
Naja, lass es uns erstmal ins Wiki hauen und dann entscheiden wir, oder dann fühlt sich irgendjemand berufen und macht eine Übersetzung ins Englische.
Ja, okay. Also ich bin nicht so begeistert von, aber naja, wie gesagt, die Zeit bleibt nicht stehen und dass diese Aufgabe sinnvoll ist und getan werden sollte, das sieht ja wirklich jeder, ne?
Ja. Dann würde ich jetzt erstmal festhalten wollen, falls es keine Gegenrede gibt. Die Übersetzung ins Englische erfolgt aus der oder von der ins Wiki übertragenen Version ausgehend. Also die Übertragung ins Englische erfolgt, nachdem die erste Version ins Wiki übernommen wurde. Gegenstimmen? Okay, dann hat Alex auch noch ein paar Anmerkungen reingemacht. Gut, ich würde dann die Doodle-Umfrage so aufsetzen, dass wir entweder die bereits abgestimmte Version ins Wiki übernehmen, die von Wolfgang und Daniel ausgearbeitete oder wie sie jetzt im Pad steht, mit Anregungen und Ergänzungen von Alex, Thomas und mir.
Ja, aber die Anmerkungen sollten doch dann noch eingearbeitet werden. Also ich würde das schon versuchen mit Daniel zusammen. Aber ein Text mit reingeschossenen Anmerkungen, den würde ich dort dann noch nicht ins Wiki stellen, oder?
Ich habe es mir jetzt noch nicht angeschaut, wie krass die Anmerkungen sind.
Aber das macht schon Sinn, denn also sonst ist der Vergleich auf den ersten Blick ja sehr erschwert beziehungsweise unmöglich. Und überhaupt würde es sich da empfehlen, das ist halt aber auch mit ein bisschen Arbeit verbunden, aber es würde sich empfehlen, dass man alle vorhandenen Versionen mal nebeneinander liegen hat. Man kann das ja, was weiß ich, per Photoshop oder so, dass man dann halt Screenshots macht von diesen Textauszügen oder was weiß ich was, dass man die alle mal nebeneinander liegen hat und dann vergleichen kann. Also das ist ein Gedanke, der mir halt gerade in den Kopf gekommen ist.
Okay, ich baue da einfach ein Doodle zusammen und dann gucken wir bis Donnerstag, wie die Mehrheit entscheidet.
Ja, gerne.
Okay, dann würde ich gerade noch zum Top 3 weiterhetzen. Beziehungsweise die Frage ist, ob wir Top 3 überhaupt jetzt dann momentan machen müssen. Geht eher um die Frage, wir nehmen uns ja jetzt viel Zeit auch für die Talks und wie wir damit jetzt umgehen. Und das nimmt uns natürlich Zeit aus unserer AG-Arbeit.
Also zum Top 3 hätte ich mal eine Frage oder einen Vorschlag. Die letzten Präsentationen waren ja meines Erachtens immer entweder Organisationsmodelle, also eigentlich Rahmen für unser MFT-Tool, oder es waren mathematische Algorithmen, also dann Bausteine für so ein MFT-Tool. Also hat natürlich alles was damit zu tun, aber bringt uns eigentlich, so wie ich das sehe, mag sein, dass ich mich irre, bringt uns eigentlich nicht vorwärts. Und ich würde mich schon bereit erklären, wenn sich dann noch ein Partner findet. So mit Daniel hatte das eigentlich schön geklappt, dass wir mal einen gewissen Rahmen erarbeiten, den man für jede Präsentation voranstellt, dass also die Vortragenden dort ihre Kernpunkte, ihre Verbindungsmöglichkeiten, ihre Beiträge vielleicht zu dem Framework doch vorneweg schon mal aufbereiten, damit wir dann konkreter über eine solche Präsentation sprechen können, beziehungsweise besser vorbereitet sind. Also wenn sich jemand bereit findet, dann würde ich mit dem gerne zusammen mal so eine Leitfaden oder wie man das nennen will, für solche Präsentationen zusammenstellen, damit eben die Effektivität größer wird.
Du Wolfgang, ich weiß gar nicht, wie viele von den Präsentationen es noch geben wird. Also haben wir noch viele Kandidaten?
Das weiß ich auch nicht. Bloß mittlerweile für jeden Vortrag, der gekommen ist, bieten sich 2 neue an. Und nach dem, was ich so sehe, gibt es da noch eine ganze Menge Kandidaten, die zumindest eine Motivation hätten, hier was loszuwerden. Ob sie auch die Motivation haben, hier was dann inhaltlich beizutragen, das weiß ich natürlich auch nicht.
Also ich kann auf alle Fälle nachvollziehen, was ich so dahinter für ein Anliegen bei dir höre, nämlich, dass wir irgendwann mal die Brücke schlagen müssen zwischen den einzelnen Projekten und dem Framework halt, ne? Und was es dann für Connections da gibt und was wie ausgetauscht wird und so weiter und so fort. Und da wäre es auch wichtig, dass die Leute also die von den anderen Projekten, dass die das auf dem Schirm haben, dass es uns da eigentlich darum geht. Ich bin mir nicht ganz sicher, ob das so richtig deutlich bei denen schon angekommen ist.
Ja, ich habe mir zum Beispiel das heutige Thema mal angeguckt. Also hinsichtlich der Intention sind wir da völlig d'accord. Da habe ich überhaupt kein Problem, völlige Übereinstimmung. So, aber was das für uns bringen kann, das würde dann wahrscheinlich in der 3. Vortragsstunde behandelt. Und das hätte ich eben gerne etwas eher, um es mal grob zu sagen.
Also die Intention war jetzt erstmal einzuladen, um erstmal auch ein bisschen Input reinzuholen in die AG. Und das, denke ich mal, ist uns schon mit den ersten beiden Sessions sehr gut gelungen. Und ja, heute ist auch, denke ich, ein Thema, was so diesen Gesamtrahmen aufzieht und beschreibt. Und im Endeffekt glaube ich auch, dass wir so eine Matrix irgendwie bräuchten, wo wir die einzelnen Themen dann ja klassifizieren können. Aber ich denke, das können wir vielleicht auch dann über die Mailingliste mit den Projekten, den Interessenten gemeinsam erarbeiten. Also auch durchaus gerne im Nachhinein, im Nachgang.
Du meinst, wo wir die verschiedenen Tools klassifizieren? Du hast gesagt Themen.
Ja, Themen, Konzepte, Ideen, Tools, alles was so reinkommt.
Ja, verstehe.
Sind wir denn schon so weit, dass wir alle möglichen verschiedenen Varianten jetzt haben?
Nö. Also es geht jetzt nur darum, dass Wolfgang gesagt hat, es wäre gut, wenn wir die Präsentation mehr strukturieren und da
Besser vorbereiten, ja.
Ja, da stimme ich auf der einen Seite zu und auf der anderen Seite würde ich sagen, das ist bisher eigentlich so ganz gut gelaufen und dass man diese ja, Aufbereitung vielleicht im Nachgang auch machen könnte.
Also ich denke auch, da sollte man vielleicht ein bisschen mehr den Präsentierenden entgegenkommen, denn also wenn ich mir vorstelle, wir intervenieren da stärker und bringen da ein bisschen mehr Struktur rein, dann kann ich mir gut vorstellen, dass viele Präsentatoren dadurch dann ein bisschen abgeschreckt sind und nicht einfach so spontan sich da so ein Ständchen in unserer Runde geben.
Na, das war eben mein Problem, dass ich von den Ständchen eigentlich ehrlich gesagt genug habe.
Es war jetzt flapsig gemeint und sollte in keinster Weise zum Ausdruck bringen, dass die unstrukturiert sind, denn wenn du mich fragst, war das bei den letzten Präsentationen nicht der Fall. Also vor allem der Pietro, der Wilfredo vorgestellt hat, der hat doch einen sehr aufgeräumten und klaren Eindruck vermittelt.
Na gut, aber das ist doch gerade auch das Beispiel vom anderen Ende. Das ist ein ganz klarer, wunderbarer mathematischer Algorithmus. Ich habe mich ja mit solchem Zeug auch jahrzehntelang rumgeschlagen. Bloß, du wirst im praktischen Falle keine verwertbaren Ausgangsdaten dafür kriegen und du wirst ein Ergebnis kriegen, was völlig exakt berechnet ist. Bloß, du kannst dem nicht vertrauen, weil schon die geringste Änderung der Ausgangsdaten wieder ein ganz anderes Ergebnis bringen könnte. Also das ist wunderbar, aber es bringt uns nichts.
Wolfgang, wir verlassen aber gerade die Ebene. Wir haben zuvor noch darüber gesprochen oder debattiert, ob die Vorträge aufgeräumt genug sind. Und jetzt kommst du mit einer inhaltlichen Kritik zu einem gewissen MFT. Das ist natürlich streitbar, keine Frage, aber man findet zu jedem MFT Vor- und Nachteile und allein der Umstand, dass hier jemand mal herkommt und mit einem Konzept aufzeigt, dass man diese Frage, ob Moderation nun sein muss oder nicht, auch mit einem Algorithmus angehen kann, schon allein das ist doch was wert.
Genau, und den Mehrwert, den wir doch bisher erarbeitet haben, ist doch eben genau der, dass wir diesen Streit über die einzelnen Methoden beiseite lassen wollen und uns eigentlich darauf verständigen wollen, die Gemeinsamkeiten herauszufinden, um halt auch Übergänge der Diskussionen von einer Methodik in die andere zu ermöglichen. Und von daher, ich sehe das momentan als sehr wertvollen Input und wir müssen halt versuchen, zwischen den Sessions, so wie das teilweise auf der Mailingliste halt auch schon passiert, in Kontakt zu kommen mit den Projekten, um dort halt auch unsere Vorstellung des Ganzen so ein bisschen ja publik zu machen und anzufangen, die Ideen dort auszutauschen. Und im Endeffekt, wenn sich alle Sessions also wenn alle Sessions gehalten sind und es keine Tools mehr gibt und Konzepte, die sich irgendwie vorstellen wollen, dann sind wir an der Reihe und dann laden wir nochmal alle ein und dann sagen wir, wie wir uns das Ganze vorstellen und ja, gucken, was da dann draus wird.
Ja,
Also
klingt gut.
mit der Idee gehe ich ja gerne und vollkommen mit. Ich habe bloß Sorge, dass ich eine begrenzte Lebenszeit habe und dass es viel mehr solche Vorschläge noch geben wird, als wir hier überhaupt uns anhören können. Und deswegen wäre ich dafür, eben sie auch möglichst frühzeitig schon zu überdenken und eben auch einzuordnen nach dem, was uns da angeboten wird. Nicht, dass
Ja,
wir uns
aber wir müssen dann auch anfangen, ein bisschen parallel vielleicht zu arbeiten und zu gucken, dass wir halt über Meta-Government.org oder sonstige Mailinglisten halt anfangen, auch unsere Ideen dann zu verbreiten. Da sehe ich überhaupt kein Problem. Aber ich denke, wir sind heute in der dritten oder wir fangen gleich mit dem dritten Talk an und lassen uns einfach mal gucken, wie es läuft und das Interesse ist da und wir sollten das mitnehmen. So, ich würde sagen, wir haben den dritten Top damit halt irgendwie vertagt. Und die Frage, die wir jetzt gerade diskutiert haben, die sollten wir nochmal irgendwie jetzt so aufbereiten, dass wir ein kleines Ergebnis haben, ob wir da jetzt irgendwie mit, ob wir das nochmal in der nächsten Sitzung besprechen oder ob wir das über E-Mail nochmal in der Woche klären oder was wir damit jetzt machen. Also wie gehen wir da jetzt weiter?
Also ich habe dafür heute überhaupt kein Problem. Ich habe 2 Beiträge für das Sync-Forum vorbereitet, die ja dann auch über die Mailingliste gehen. Und das ist dann eine Meinungsäußerung, die keinerlei Anspruch auf irgendwelche Endgültigkeit erhebt. Und dann können wir ja sehen, was sich darüber zu sprechen lohnt. Ja, also ich würde heute jetzt einfach zur Tagesordnung übergehen. Nächster Vortrag.
Okay, und dann bringst du es nochmal über die Mailingliste beziehungsweise über das Forum bringst du das Thema nochmal ein.
Genau.
Gut, dann schreibe ich das als To-Do für dich auf. So, dann kann schon mal einer, denke ich mal, dann sind wir durch mit unseren Tops. Jetzt den Top 3 vertagen wir auf nächstes Mal oder auf die Mailingliste über die Woche. Dann, kann schon mal jemand Slash vielleicht oder so die Anwesenden vielleicht mal einführen, begrüßen, Hallo sagen.
Das kommt mir jetzt gerade ein bisschen blöde. Ich wollte gerade ganz kurz raus und einkaufen, weil ich sonst kein Abendbrot für heute habe.
Okay, dann Sekunde noch eben.
Ansonsten Freiwillige vor, will jemand anders ansonsten vorstellen? Ich düse jetzt kurz los, bin gleich zurück.
Mein Vorschlag, die Leute stellen sich selber vor. Und wir sollten
Ja,
jetzt
nee, das ist zu viel. Also wir haben jetzt konkret den Vortrag und I think we should switch to English now. So hello everybody and welcome to our third International E-Democracy Talk. And today Say will present the idea and the concept behind MakeYourLaws.org. And I'm very glad that this will be took place today. And so I think we should start right now. And Say it's up to you. So maybe you can introduce yourself and start.
Sure. I'm gonna actually turn on my mic. There. Now I won't have to hold the push to talk button. So hi, my name is Sai. My handle is Saizai. I started MakeYourLaws about half a year ago. I originally registered the domain name in I think 2008, and so I've been thinking about it for a good long while now. In part significantly, and it's inspired by you guys in the German Pirate Party. Though I've been reading quite a lot of stuff, everything ranging from fairly formal and terribly, terribly geeky stuff about law. Like, I'm looking at a book on my desk called Administrative Justice in the United States, which is all about administrative law. And if you're not a lawyer and you're reading that, you're probably about as wonky as it gets. To, things regarding user experience design and so forth. So it might help to give you a sense of what my goals are, because I think they are different in some significant ways from what the Pirate Party is doing. And they constrain me in different ways. So my goal is to basically make a one-stop tool, a website where people can go to make their laws, and that means everything. So there's a number of things. One is this would be in all jurisdictions at all levels of government worldwide, ultimately. To start with, I'm concentrating at US, at the state level, simply because that's easier for me to deal with organizationally and legally and so forth. But that's, ultimately that's just a starting pot. Another is that I want this to be not just sort of for a party, not just for a group of people who you can more or less rely on to agree on sort of the major issues of the platform. And you can assume that, for instance, within the Pirate Party, you'll probably be able to come to an agreement on, say, copyright reform, or on, whether Tor should be legal, right? It's very unlikely that you're going to have significant disagreement about that. But in my case, I can't assume that at all, because I want to make a tool for literally every voter to use. And one of the core assumptions, therefore, is people are not going to agree on everything. And in particular, it's not even going to be consistent. So in California, for example, we legalized marijuana. In North Carolina, where I was living not too long ago, it's definitely not legal. Although it's not as illegal as it is in, say, I don't know, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So there's this assumption, I think, that you have to make in a party where you have sort of a smaller group, and so different techniques work there. What else? So there's three kind of main aspects of how to implement it, and they're all based on another assumption, which is we can't block on anything external. We can't block on changing the law first. We can't block on getting politicians to cooperate first. We can, of course, try to leverage them to cooperate, but that has to be done through our existing power. And we can't do things through non-legal means. There's a time and place for marching and protests and so forth, and civil disobedience. I'm not going to say anything against that. It's just not what I'm doing. So there's three sort of main branches of how laws effectively get passed in the United States. And those are the ones that I'm focused on. The first is through voter initiative. In about half of the U.S. states, not all, not even a full 50%, I think it's like 24 states, have voter initiative, which means that if enough people sign a petition for qualification to ballot, then that law or bill really gets put on the ballot, and then at the yearly election everybody votes on it, and if it gets a majority then it passes into law. And there are similar rules regarding modifying state constitutions. It's a very similar process. The bars are just higher. To give you a sense of how difficult this is, however, in California, for instance, granted California is one of the most populous states, it requires about 300,000 to 500,000 verified signatures to get something onto a ballot. The the way that signatures are currently being collected is literally you hire college kids to stand around on street corners in a commercial district and hand people clipboards and ask them to sign it. They get about $1 to $4 per signature for that. Now, if you consider that the validity rate when they're verified is around 60 to 70%, and you need around 300 to 500,000 signatures, so call that 400,000 times 10 over 6, or 10 over 6, times around $2, you're talking a couple $1 million, and that's just to get it on the ballot. That's not even advertising. That's not organization. None of that. The result of that is essentially that although it's meant to be a sort of the most democratic process, it's effectively not. It's effectively only done by people who are very well organized and have a lot of money, because those are the only people who can afford to get it on the ballot in the first place, let alone advertise for it. And I think that could be ameliorated a lot. There are some very annoying court decisions, shall we say. There's one recently called Nee versus Slocum, which said that according to California law, it's not legal to submit ballot petitions with non-physical signatures. So although we do have electronic signatures laws, those are, according to that court, which is the first appellate court, they're not allowed for electoral purposes, only for commercial purposes. I think that's kind of bullshit. So that means that basically either we have to find a loophole, and I'll get to that in a sec, or we have to fight them in court, or both, most likely. However, we're hackers, so there's always loopholes. In particular, the worst case scenario of this is basically we give people a PDF and say, print this, sign it, fold it, stick it in your mailbox. It's pre-printed with, non-profit mailing rate and so forth, or business reply, whatever. It'll cost us something like 30 cents per, which is still a lot cheaper than it is otherwise. More ideally, we could have people sign it online. Sort of a medium case is they print it, sign it, scan it, upload it, and then we fax it to the Secretary of State's office, etc. But I think we could improve the experience a lot. Then the next question is, okay, so you can get stuff on the ballot, but how do you get the thing that you want to put on the ballot? How do you decide on a policy? How do you turn it into a well-drafted bill? How do you make sure that it's been discussed well, etc.? And that's a whole policy discussion system that I think we're probably going to spend the majority of this talking about. So I'm going to just point it out and defer it to later, so I can first just go do the overview. The other way, of course, that you get stuff passed is by manipulating politicians. This is called lobbying in the nice sense, bribery in the more blunt sense. And this ranges anywhere from hiring somebody who's friends with the politician who happens to be on the committee that gets to decide whether your bill gets passed or not, have a nice chat with them for, $200 an hour or whatever they charge, to campaign donations to that person, etc. It's unlike in Germany, my understanding is you guys are able to donate to political parties, to political actors, and so forth, but you're given a fair amount of money from the federal government, enough that you don't really have as big of a deal with private funding of campaigns as we have in the US. In the US, there is not really that kind of public funding of campaigns. It's virtually all private. As a result, especially with the recent decisions in Citizens United, in Kerry, in Speech Now, and I can go over the legal history if you're interested. But the result is essentially that rich individuals and corporations can give unlimited amounts to advocate for or against the election of a politician, and they can do so anonymously. And they can do stuff basically in ways that ordinary people don't really have access to. So, for instance, one thing I mentioned is, that it's essentially bribery. It gets worse, though. So, for instance, there's something called Super PAC insurance. So Super PAC is a type of political action committee, a PAC, which spends all of its money, quote unquote, independently. So they run their own ads. They don't consult with the politician about how they run their ads or what the content of the ads are. But they can collaborate, shall we say, in technically non-coordinated ways, but are effectively coordinated. So, for example, Karl Rove has a super PAC called American Crossroads, and they run a bunch of anti-Obama ads, pro-Romney ads. So a super PAC can also just, have a large savings account of, say, several $1 million, and they can go to a politician and say, dear Senator Bob, we noticed that you're on the committee for appropriations for this bill or whatever, and we really need you to vote on this bill, to vote yes or vote no or whatever you want to do. And hint, hint, if you don't do so, we have $50 million sitting around in our bank account, and we will be happy to drop $1 million of that in favor of your opponent when you come up for re-election at the last minute, in a way that you, whose campaign normally costs $50,000, will have no chance in hell of overcoming. So it's essentially blackmail, but it's legal. It's perfectly legal. The problem is that we don't really have similar tools at our disposal. And part of the idea of this is to do that. Not necessarily to do it in quite so black hat a way. I think it can be done white hat. But to give the same kind of coordinated action power to individuals that major corporations have. Through money. Campaign finance is a thing, and we can't really ignore it. We can simultaneously try to pass campaign finance reform so that it doesn't have to be done this way, but in the meantime, you have to fight money with money. So I think that's a good overview overall. Before I get into how I see the policy discussion system per se, does anyone have any questions or comments on what I've said so far?
A quick question, Si.
Yeah.
Was that last one, the super PACs, was that the third method of getting laws passed?
Well, more broadly speaking, what I jokingly refer to as politician puppetry. Finance is one of several tools. There are honest politicians occasionally, and those people you have to influence ideologically. Not just, this is what your party says, or this is, how much money is going to be donated to your re-election campaign, but you get a friend of theirs from college or whatever who is a lobbyist to have dinner with them and influence them. There are lots of ways to influence a politician. Look at SOPA, for instance. SOPA was basically one massive, way over the top organizing effort for one bill, two bills, a coordinated bill, but whatever. But we can't do that every single time. We can't black out Wikipedia every single time they do something fucking retarded. We need effective lobbying. And that's going to involve a lot of things. But I mean, we need lobbyists. We need to be paying them off just like everyone else does, in a more coordinated fashion, in a way that they can brag about. If they get, $1,000 each from 50 people, that's not quite as cool as getting $50 each from 1,000 people, right? It doesn't play well.
I was just wondering about the categories. So we have category one way of getting laws passed is voter initiatives. A second
voter
is
initiative
lobbying.
And politician puppetry. Yeah.
That's number two. Politician.
And the third is not a way of getting it passed. It's how you author it in the first place. And that I just haven't really addressed yet.
Oh, you haven't got to number 3 yet. Okay, I'm sorry.
I only just briefly mentioned it, which is we need a way to discuss policy, to transform it into effective law, etc. But this is separate from how do you get it passed, right? So if someone came and said, here is a proposal, it's already finalized, we want to get it on the ballot, how can we do that? Right? Like that's one question of how do you get something passed that's already got community support, that already is something where you could basically run a Kickstarter for it, except Kickstarter doesn't do politics, but we would, that sort of thing. And then there's basically the 2 branches of that, through politicians or directly. Then the question is, though, where do you get that in the first place? How do you write a really good bill? So that's a separate question.
Oh, okay. It's maybe not important. I was expecting just 3 simple categories, like voter initiatives. Number 2 would be lobbying and something else. But I get your gist. That's okay. I get your gist. Please go on.
Sure. Anyone else?
Just one hint. So I will post a link to a pirate pad now. And with this pad, we can collect questions while the presentation is running. And cool. Maybe Say can also post some links to the pad or make some descriptive notes to his speech, because not everybody is able to understand English in its best. So maybe some words might be good to have them seen in the pad.
Fine by me. Let me know if I say anything that you don't understand. I do use some legal jargon that I'm just totally used to, but I realize that not everyone knows American legal jargon, even Americans, let alone Germans. So I'm impressed that you guys are virtually all as fluent in English as you are. It's way better than my German. So, yes. Anyway, any other questions before I get to the issue of policy authorship? No? Okay. So policy authorship is a curious thing. The main way that I've seen other people approach this problem before, including you guys, and including the person who was talking last week, is based on sort of the current model of how bills are passed in the legislature, which is somebody a proposal comes up, somebody who's a proponent comes up with some proposal for a bill that is mostly fleshed out, maybe not perfectly, but it's sort of a coherent idea for like a single thing that they want to pass. And then people discuss it, and maybe there's some way of submitting changes to that. Typically they get to have dictatorial control over what edits are made to their proposal. Sometimes you go with eager forking, where everybody has their own branch, and there's like 100 different forks, etc. This seems to me to be a really flawed approach for what we are trying to do, or for what I'm trying to do at least. Like I said, I think that this is less flawed for a situation where you're only trying to make a decision on the order of 20 people in a more homogeneous culture. When you're talking about sicking, thousands or millions of people at it, it's just not possible for a few reasons. One is if you have the bill and amendments paradigm, then you have people feel really attached to their original proposal and feel like it's their proposal, and that they get to choose what's in it. it's not conducive to real brainstorming. Another is that it requires the original proponent to put a lot of personal work into it, or to have a group behind them, such that they can flesh it out enough to be worth considering. And maybe they're not that good of a policy wonk. Maybe they don't know really even how criminal law works, for instance. Suppose you're talking about something to decriminalize the possession of cocaine, for instance, but not completely, right? If you were writing that kind of bill, you would have to know what are the current categories of criminal punishment, how are criminal sentences done, etc. And maybe this person's idea is just like, let's try to direct people to treatment rather than jail, in some circumstances which seem okay. But they can't really think it through fully. If your bar is, well, you have to give us a full proposal, or at least a reasonably fleshed out one, before we'll consider it, then you just never hear from them. Another problem is that it's just overwhelming. So for instance, one thing that I think you guys often assume very, very incorrectly is that people have the time, interest, or ability to read every proposal, even in a small group of proposals, let alone say across the entire system of all sorts of laws that people might want to pass. That's just not true. In the US, politicians barely even read the vast majority of bills. They're done in committees for the most part, and even then there's subcommittees. So you usually only have a couple people reading things the first time, and that's only for the most important ones that lobbyists have convinced them to look at. And that's, it's a shitty process. It doesn't scale. And that's, for someone who's concentrated, even, people who are full-time policy analysts, like people at the ACLU, for instance, or people at a think tank, they can't handle everything. They look at some specific thing. So you need some more lightweight way of still having your voice be heard, still interacting, still making sure that your values are being represented, than full interaction of reading a proposal, commenting on it in detail, etc. And frankly, maybe you're just not into being a policy wonk. Maybe you're anti-abortion, but you couldn't give a shit about the AMA's, the American Medical Association's, like, standards for how to perform certain medical procedures, or the really arcane stuff that is like how is insurance processed financially. And you still want your voice heard. So to some extent you can solve this by proxies, of course. So here I'm assuming throughout that we have a liquid democracy system backing this. So just to be clear on what I mean by a liquid democracy system, this is a system where everybody can have many proxies, as many as they want. Any given proxy can be limited by the person proxying to them to any category or set of categories. The proxy doesn't know who is proxying to them, but the person proxying to them does know all of their votes in the area, at least, that for which they're serving as a proxy. So it's transparent in reverse, but it's private forward. And I don't know, there are various other edge cases to correct for security issues. But basically that's the idea. And if there's conflicts, then you have that be resolved by whoever is proxying to them. So for example, if you have two proxies who are both authorized to vote for you on some given issue, and they disagree significantly on how to vote, then you have to resolve it. And they would have position statements on the issue or whatever, so they can try to convince you one way or the other. So I'm assuming that we have all that. The way that I would approach it is rather than having bills that say, here's the change I want to make, have instead sort of almost an outline, as it were, of what should be the state of the law. Not what should be the changes, but what should the law be. So, for instance, you wouldn't say, I want a tax cut. That is a meaningless thing in isolation. Like if you don't know what jurisdiction are you talking about? Where in time are you talking about? It doesn't mean anything. Whereas if you say, I think that capital gains should be taxed at some percentage, or, I want this sort of curve of burden of taxes, or I think, possession of marijuana with intent to sell while carrying a weapon should be punished by, X years in jail, prison. These are sort of more objective terms. And then what you can do is break it down as well by components. So if you were to think of it in terms of diffs, suppose you thought of a bill and thought of where are all the places that either it's a diff against the status quo in any given jurisdiction that we're tracking, or it's something where people are likely to want to fork this specific components, right? So by a component, I mean, for instance, in drugs policy, just for example, a component might be, what is the punishment for this class of crime? Another component would be, what things are included in this class. So, for example, in the U.S., we have drug scheduling, Schedule 1, 2, and 3, 4, etc. of, depending on how bad a drug is, and the punishments are tied to what schedule it is. So these are sort of distinct issues. And if you break it out by components, and you can basically frame it as questions for each thing, where you say, okay, so what things should we consider Schedule 1? And then you can vote on every single item that might be an answer to that question. And then you can say, so for Schedule 1 items, what should be the punishment, etc. So you can break this down so that when you're having arguments, you can have them over a very specific thing, and you don't have to have the whole thing all at once. You don't have to consider a huge diff at once where you're changing like hundreds of different things simultaneously. People can just focus on the parts that they care about. The other advantage of this is I'm assuming that people are not lawyers. Granted, I am an exception to this. I'm not a lawyer, but I know a lot about law, more than any reasonable person should if they're not a lawyer. But most people are not, and they should not be trying to write laws in legalese. That's a question. That's just as much as, code is for hackers, the law is for lawyers. It is a specialized language of its own. You can have bugs of all sorts of kinds, and it's intimidating to look at. So rather, I think that the policy discussion should be framed in very plain language terms, very clear, that anyone should be able to understand as much as possible. And then finally what would happen is you look in a given jurisdiction. So that jurisdiction could be a country like Germany, if you want to pass something at the federal level. It could be a U.S. state. It could be some city, anything, anywhere, and say, are there enough people in that jurisdiction for it to be viable to turn into law there? Is there enough support for it in that area? Because, of course, there's no such thing as international law in this sense, right? And if there are, then you collate sort of what are the top ideas there. What is the policy that the people there want to enact? You extract that, And then you turn that into legalese. Then you actually hire lawyers and say, we want professional legal drafters to turn this policy idea into law. Then you have people review it as sort of a final draft of actual legalese, look for loopholes, look for inconsistency with what people were trying to pass, and then you enter the phase of passing this into law through either politicians or through voter initiatives. And I would like to point out, of course, that the end goal for me is completely replacing legislatures with liquid democracies directly. The intermediate stage of that would be the point where we have politicians sufficiently controlled that they basically will effectively vote whatever way we want. And that's very similar to what you have in the Pirate Party, except that they're voting whatever way people in the Pirate Party want, not the whatever way people in any party in Germany want. So it's broader than that. Once we have enough such people, then we could just abolish the legislature and replace it directly with votes. But that's sort of a very long-term issue. That's on the order of a century. It'll take a while. And these are long-term plans. I'm assuming that we should be able to pass a law like this within a couple of years by voter initiative, but getting significant traction in Congress, in state Congresses, etc., in the US alone, let alone internationally, is going to take a long time. I think that's enough for an overview. I did give one link in the email I sent. Let me look that up again, which is about this discussion system. Here we go. And this specifically talks about the idea of a sort of a gradual discussion system where you have lazy forking. And lazy forking means basically if anyone has a significant disagreement, then that's an indication that you should fork some component. So ideally you want people to just discuss it and come to some consensus, but the way you can tell that there isn't consensus, that there is a significant disagreement, is just you don't agree, so you make another option. Very simple. And then people can vote, liquid vote, on which options to concentrate on which options have more support. And you don't have to fork the whole thing at once, just a component. I think that's enough for an overview, and there's probably questions. First, I'm going to look at the two that are written in the pad. Let's see. Assuming that your solution is implemented, in what way does it enable me to make my own laws? Can you give an example? And second, if I choose to participate, how could the law that is passed be different than it would otherwise be? Okay, those are both pretty good questions. So addressing the first one, supposing that is implemented, the way it would let you make your own laws is you would discuss the policies that you want to pass with other people who are also participating. And if there's enough people that is viable to just start, and the bar for that is actually relatively low. The bar for qualifying to qualify, as it were, in California is about 10, 20 signatures. I forget exactly. And that's just to get it, assigned an ID number, and you're allowed to gather signatures and stuff like that. It's not that high. And it's doable if you have any serious support. If you pass that bar, then we would ramp it up. We'd make it something where you can sign this petition online in a legally binding way, in a way that actually means something. And if enough people are interested in this law, and you Reddit it or you Twitter the hell out of it or whatever, and people sign it who are legally citizens of that jurisdiction. So sorry, Germans don't get to vote on California law. But if enough people support it and take some as action to support it, action that we would try to make as zero barrier as possible. It should be very, very low barrier to participation, but you do still have to take some action. Then it becomes law. That is how the laws are made in California, at least. The other method, of course, is if you want something to become law and you don't have voter initiative rights, or it's difficult for whatever reason to pass through voter initiative, then you can try pressuring a legislator. You can do things, for instance, this is something that I'm discussing with the FEC. It's not entirely clear whether we're allowed to do this or not. But you could, for instance, contribute, along with 1,000 of your closest Twitter friends, $50 to Senator Bob, who is chairman of the committee that is reviewing this bill that we want to pass, and say, these $50 are contingent on it getting out of this committee. And if Bob manages to shepherd it out of his committee, then Bob gets your $50, and along with your 1,000 friends. If he doesn't, then it goes to his opponent, for instance. So this is what I call a contingent earmarking. I'm reasonably sure that can be legal, but obviously it's an unexplored area of law, shall we say. If I choose to participate, how could the law that is passed be different than it would otherwise be? Well, the question is how different your preferences are from what is currently being represented. I would say that if you're genuinely satisfied that the groups that are putting to ballot voter initiatives in your area, or the politicians who are nominally representing you in Congress, are actually representing your interests, then the law would not be different. Then, in fact, you might be harmed by it because I would be taking power away from those entrenched groups. If, however, you don't think that's the case, then I would say the better that we can represent you along with everybody else in that jurisdiction, the closer it'll resemble what you want. And whether you care about that difference is really up to you. All I can do is try to make the system to give you the power. I can't determine what you're going to do with it. Can you give an example? Blah, did initiate a position? Okay, yeah, that's just notes. Is there running code to test out? There's very sketchy running code. So there's a login system. I've done most of the PayPal integration that's necessary. There's the bare startings of something to track committees through the official sites and initiatives and so forth. But right now I'm the only developer on it. It's just a little bit more than I'm going to be able to do by a month from now. And I've only tried to code so far the economic side of it. I have not tried to code the policy discussion system yet because I was focused on the money side because that was more urgent. Simply because we missed the time to actually participate in the policy authorship side. The lead time on that is on the order of at least a year to really be able to be effective, because first you need to talk about it, and then you need to figure out what law to pass, then you need to get people to sign it in enough numbers, and that takes at least 3 months, etc. So no, there isn't code because that wasn't my priority. I've been more thinking of just the design of it. How does it improve the quality of a discussion? It improves the quality by a few things. For one, you divorce the idea from the person proposing the idea. And if you're just saying, okay, well, these are the options, and this is sort of how I support this idea or that idea, or here's a different option to propose, people don't feel as tied to some specific thing, and they don't feel as much that in any given decision they're comparing it to the default, which is whatever the first person proposed. I don't think that's a good default to have. Maybe their proposal wasn't that great. Maybe it was great, but it should vie on an equal level. Another thing is that it allows for a broader range of participation. Like I said, there's going to be a lot of people in the system who are chiefly voting on values. They're not going to be involved in the low-level discussions of, how do we define capital gains, and how should it be taxed, and what are the exemptions, and blah blah blah, right? Like, that's for wonks. There's going to be some portion of people who will participate in that. Everyone should be able to participate in that as freely as possible, but that doesn't mean that they're going to want to, and you shouldn't force them to do that for them to have a voice. Rather, you should allow them to. You should make it as easy as possible for them to find proxies who represent their views, who are active, who are good discussants, like they're not trolls or whatever, and as easy as possible for them to participate as much as possible as they want and no more. So, for instance, if they want to opine on supporting the legalization of marijuana in general, but they don't want to be involved in defining like the specifics of what is a drug treatment program or whatever, they should be able to do that. And if you componentize it and you make it sort of hierarchical, then they can basically opine on sort of this top level question without having to express an opinion on all the detailed subcomponents. Who is the target group? Target group is everybody, and that's an important issue. So, not to be too blunt about it, but liquid feedback has a major problem with design, which is it's made for hackers, and it really shows. It's usable in a sense, but it's not something that people are going to want to use when they're the general public. And it has to be literally as easy and desirable to use as Twitter. So there are some interesting issues there, of course. Some are just usability issues. Some are issues that actually get to the next question. So I'll just tie it in there. So the next question is, how much does the system need to be moderated or administrated? And the answer is actually a significant amount. Now, we should not restrict people's ability to post new ideas. We should not require people to be non-anonymous to talk, although I'll get to that in 1 second. And so forth. You should have freedom of speech, but trolls are a problem. Troll was a problem last week when we were having this hangout. And to have a healthy discussion system to avoid eternal Septembers, you do need to have moderation. That moderation can be bottom up. So, for instance, Stack Overflow has pretty good moderation, and it's done entirely by sort of community. I think that there's a system called Reflect or Considerate. I'll try to find a link of that if someone doesn't get it first. Which it's by Travis Kripling. So anyway, I'll finish talking because I can't talk and write at the same time. Which essentially it's a commenting system where there are annotations in the sidebar. So it's longer form comments, like a forum thread or something, where other users can summarize your argument, can summarize what you're saying in the sidebar, and that can have all the usual meta moderation ratings of, this is accurate, or this is snarky, or this is a flame bait comment, or whatever. And people can basically get karma scores for how good are they at reflecting other people's views. And I think that's a pretty good indicator for whether they'd be a good moderator, especially if they're good at reflecting the views in a way that the other person will agree is an accurate reflection of their views, of people who disagree with them on policy. So if you're able to actually sort of reflect and summarize what other people believe in a way that they would agree with, even when they disagree with you, that's a good indication that you're a good moderator. And that's something that could be promoted as sort of one of the mechanisms to give moderation privilege. Another thing is, so like I said, I think that you should be allowed to be pseudonymous. However, in order to get a vote, you have to be identified by your legal identity in a given jurisdiction. If you're just a random pseudonym, you don't get a vote. You don't get your own vote. However, you can be a proxy. You could be a proxy for yourself, in fact. And of course, proxies, who somebody proxies to is private. So you could have a pseudonymous identity that the system knows is in fact representing the vote of, Bob Doe, and Bob Doe is authorized to vote in California or whatever. We've checked their legal identity, we've checked that they're registered to vote, things like that. And in Germany, you have it a lot easier because you have the cards with the electronic signatures on them. We do not have anything like that. But you need to be identified to vote, but you can proxy anybody's vote. So if you're, some on 4chan and you get people to proxy to you, so you say, here's my MakeYourLaws account. Hey, all you anons, why don't you back me? Here's my policies. The account itself is pseudonymous. The fact that somebody's proxying to them is anonymous. They would get to talk just as on par with anybody else who is a proxy. The only requirement is, in order to be visible, you have to be proxying at least one vote. That could be your own. And that basically eliminates sock puppets while preserving the ability to have pseudonyms. What next? If a proxy changes their vote or position, do you still keep their voters? That's actually an interesting question, and it gets to an aspect of how I see liquid democracy that I didn't really talk about in detail, which is basically I see the issue of proxies as a recommendation problem. So just as on Netflix, for instance, you have recommendations for what movies you might like, you should have recommendations for what proxies you might like. And you should have automated bots. This is how I would describe it to hackers. Obviously, this is not necessarily how it would be described to the public, but I'm using more technical stuff for you. Where the bot basically analyzes the end space of ideological positions. So if I don't know how many of you are familiar with support vector machines, SVMs. It's a very popular kind of AI. But the idea of an SVM is basically you map a vector of features and transform it into a high-dimensional space, end space, and then reduce that space a certain amount so that you can find, actually this is sort of more accurate of an SVN, which is a different thing, but you basically reduce it so you can find the eigenvectors of that space and say what areas of ideological space are similar, right? So if someone votes in support of, say, legalizing marijuana, they're likely to also support environmental issues, right? They're likely to support Greenpeace, for instance. And what you can do from that is try to find recommendations for people of, you give them a short quiz or something like that, which are basically the eigen questions, as it were, of ideological space. And right now there's one site that tries to do this, which is called politicalcompass.com. I'm not convinced that what they have is in fact the best way to go about it, but this is something that's totally an empirical question we could test. So you ask them some questions, you find people who represent them well, and you do this ongoingly. So if, for instance, your proxy changes their position, either in the sense that they are deviating significantly from their previous history, or they're deviating significantly from the consensus of their own cohort. So, for instance, you have, say, somebody who represents EFF type positions, and they vote for SOPA. Then that's one thing. And another case is where they deviate significantly, where your ultimate, because you might have several loops, right? If your ultimate proxy deviates significantly from your own positions. So any of these three cases, we'd send you a priority review message. So normally, of course, we'd send you email all the time saying, your proxy did this, your proxy did that, and you have 1 week to review it or so. But even those, you probably would just sort of briefly skim. So for the more important ones, which is basically cases where there is a controversy, cases where there's a disagreement among your proxies, or cases where it looks like, according to the AI, it looks like your proxy is either doing something fishy, like trying to vote in a way that you probably don't actually support, or just, changing their mind. Then we should highlight that to you. And of course, they should get a chance to argue their case. They should have a position statement on everything that they're doing as a proxy. And I think that's actually potentially a very positive thing. I don't want people to feel like they're locked into a given ideology, and I think that allowing people to change their positions on things and convince people to go along with that is actually a very positive thing for a healthy democracy. Let's see, what else? Who administrates the system and has root access? That would be a question of what system we're talking about. If you're talking about specifically MakeYourLaws, I have root, and one other person has root, and that's only temporarily because he was fixing a PHP issue. Longer term, that would depend on, people are going to have root when they're sysadmins. I mean, I don't know what to tell you on that. Obviously, there would be non-disclosure agreements. There would be other sort of contractual obligations, same as any company has to protect their users' privacy. And obviously, we'd want to compartmentalize the information and encrypt things one way where possible, encrypt things two ways where it's something where it has to be reversible in some circumstances. So, for instance, I don't actually think this is necessarily a good way to verify somebody's identity, but suppose that we took scans of somebody's driver's license to verify their identity. That is something that would probably be unencrypted briefly, so that it can be reviewed by a human and verify that, yeah, that looks, legit, and it looks like it's the name that is they're claiming they are, and so forth. And then at that point, you'd one-way encrypt it, delete the original, and encrypt it to only a key that's like stored in a bank vault or something. So that if you need to prove it to somebody, like a court or something, you can. But in general, you'd be able to store it securely. Main parts of the system, I don't even know how to answer that, because that could be anything from conceptual parts to computer architecture. Computer architecture, I don't think would be appropriate for me to talk about for a system that's not fully architected yet. So I'm sorry, I can't really answer that. Decentralization. Yes, we have thought about that. Decentralization is an interesting question. There are a number of problems with it. So the foremost problem is really an issue of bandwagon effect, which is you need to get enough users in the same place working with what to them is the same system. Now, I'll stress that that's a very different thing than a backend. For it to work, if it's something like diaspora, it'll die, just like diaspora dies, because it'll just be fragmented. And I think this is also a problem that's sort of facing us as a community of hackers who are working on this issue, is ultimately we do need to collaborate and to centralize. And I know that's a very unhackish tendency, but this isn't something like, a code forking area where it's okay if everything dies except for, a couple forks, and it's okay if whoever was developing using that fork doesn't get to do so anymore because they can switch. Users are not going to switch as readily. It's just a reality. That said, I do think a lot of the back end can be decentralized. So some parts cannot. Some parts require certain kinds of trust. So for instance, or money. So for instance, checking whether someone is registered to vote. There are legal restrictions in the US at least on who is allowed to have access to voter registration databases. And this is state by state. Some states, they're like, here's our FTP, download the voter registration database. Some states are more like, give us $10,000 and sign this contract, and you have to be a political entity, and you're not allowed to disclose it to anybody else. And that's not really something that you can decentralize. And it needs to be done by somebody that people trust. That's a case for centralization. A case for decentralization, however, is the amount to which we can publish publicly. So for instance, if we were using a backend system for tracking the voting, like Agora Ciudadana, or like what's the one I'm totally blanking? Not Votarola, although Votarola is also interesting. I'm totally blanking on it. Someone will remember. Sorry, I'm just drawing a complete blank. But the public proofs, the cryptographic proofs, for instance, if it can be published publicly, it should be published in a decentralized way, such that it can't be gone back on, such that there's public record of what has happened, there's public history, etc. There's other things that can be decentralized if you have a central API. So for example, Twitter, right? So Twitter is centralized in the sense that the database is centralized, although there are decentralized caches. The registration is centralized, but there's all sorts of Twitter clients, right? You don't need to use the Twitter website at all to use Twitter. You can use tons and tons of clients. And I think that's actually a really good thing. As long as the needs that are met, that do need to be centralized are met, which is a common user base, a common system of documents, or whatever the non-document based system is, a common sort of meeting place, a common trust, as long as you have those things, I think there's a lot of stuff that you can decentralize via API, via just publishing your data publicly and asking people to verify it and to mirror it. But I don't think it can be totally decentralized. I realize that there are security trade-offs in the formal sense with that, but at that point, I think the formal security runs into the problem that fact does not match its assumptions. What's the difference with liquid feedback or adhocracy? Honestly, I don't know enough about the specifics, but if someone does, I'm happy to discuss that. I think it's very similar in principle, specifically regarding, what are considered proxies and how do proxies operate. So like I said, I can just give an overview of that again, so it's clear. Proxies, in my envisionment, are voluntarily entered into. If you are acting as a proxy, you have to be a public proxy. You could be a public pseudonymous proxy, and that's okay. But all proxies are essentially public, though you don't have to reveal who you are. The proxy power can be limited by category. And I realize category is a tricky issue there, and we can discuss that if you want, but I'll not get into it for the sake of simplicity. Proxies can be transferable. Proxies are always reviewed, so proxies are just sort of a convenience mechanism. Proxies need recommendation systems, so you can find the proxies that are you would be interested in delegating to. And proxies are going to fulfill a wide variety of roles. So they will be everything from, a lawyer who is a policy wonk on some very specific issue of like tax law, to somebody who is a sort of a representative for a given ideology who argues for their positions, to somebody who just tracks like who are the experts on this issue. Like the relatively neutral academic or whatever experts, etc. You're going to have a wide variety of roles, and they're all going to be participating together. Extension points to hook into other systems. That would be interesting. Like I said, I'm a fan of an API method, and I think that it would be a really good idea for us to figure out jointly how we could come up with an API such that different people can work on different parts of the problem. So for instance, identification in a given jurisdiction is one part of the problem. Honestly, I personally would rather not have to identify German voters. I don't know anything about German law. I don't know, anything about the details of your electronic ID cards, etc. Whereas I know a fair amount about U.S. law, and I know a fair amount about how to identify people in the U.S. And I think that's something that could totally be separated out. And similarly, actually, the Pirate Party has a very equivalent issue, which is the Pirate Party needs to identify, is this person a member of the Pirate Party? Do they get to vote on Pirate Party decisions? And that's something that should be done through some very simple API, like we whether someone owns an email address the usual way, like any other system does online, and you would have a backend system where our backends can talk to each other and say, is this email address authorized to vote in Pirate Party matters? And you can do it like that. So, for instance, groups like the Pirate Party or other parties, the Tea Party, I'm sure you two would disagree on lots of things, but groups should also be able to organize their internal stuff using essentially the exact same system. I think that's everything for the written questions. So, does anyone have anything to actually say? I've kind of ranted for a while. I want someone else to talk. Hint, hint, that means you.
Well, I guess I can ask. Sorry, I guess I can ask a question here. I apologize for my earlier question. I didn't word it very well. I'm sorry.
Which one was it?
It's just about the categories of how to change laws, but that's unimportant.
Oh.
I guess just going back to my question here, number 2, I don't have a complete answer there. In a sense, it seems that you're telling me that things will be as they already are. That's what I get actually from number 1. From number 2, if I'm just an ordinary guy who can choose whether to participate in your system or not, it's not clear to me how actually participating, spending, say, a couple hours a week at it, could actually have an effect on the law at the end. That's really what I want to come down to in question number 2 there.
I don't see why you think that. So do you think that, for instance, the system would never be able to pass a law? Or do you think that the laws that it would pass would be identical to the laws that are already being passed by Congress?
I think that if I choose not to participate, the law that it's passed will be a certain way. And then if I choose just personally, me, to participate, the result will be exactly the same. My participation will have no effect on the end result with your solution. This is what I'm suggesting. And I'm asking you, am I right or wrong?
I think you're wrong, but I mean, the amount of power you have on any given thing will be proportional to both proportional to the number of people participating directly, in the sense that the more people participate, the more likely it is to happen. But also your relative proportion is going to be inversely proportional. If there's 1,000 people voting on some component, then you're 1,000th of that vote. Whereas if you're talking about some more detailed part of it, where maybe 20 people are discussing how to decide that particular component, you could have a pretty significant impact. You could have an impact in proposing something that people haven't proposed before, that other people think are a good idea, and that turns into a law. The point is simply that I want to give you as much power as you would have in a direct democracy, with the improvements that a liquid democracy brings of convenience. But you still have to convince people to support your law. You still have to convince enough people to at least give a shit a little bit, if not to have to read the whole thing in detail. You still have to eventually get a majority to support and pass it. Although that's not entirely something that I agree with. I think that it probably should just be a majority of the people participating in a given discussion, but that's how the law is currently, so we have to work within the existing system. Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
It hinges on... sorry, I pressed F11 in the wrong window and it went nuts. My key here. So it hinges on, as I've written, proposing novel details. Mostly it's on the details that I could contribute and make a difference.
For the policy discussion part, if you want, so I guess it depends what you mean by having a real influence. So there is the aspect of influence which is seeing a law passed where you wrote some line of that law, or you wrote some paragraphs of that law or whatever. Yes, that's going to be rare. Laws are finite in size, hopefully, and ideally they're in fact better short than long. And sure, not everyone is going to have part of that. Not everyone is going to have some idea that's totally new, but that's okay, right? I don't know if you use Reddit, for instance, but there are people who find some random thing that people love, and then there's everybody who +1s it. And everybody who does that incremental amount is still having an influence. It's collectively, they're still voicing their opinion. And if that amount of interaction is sort of not satisfying enough to you, then you should participate in the more detailed discussions. But ultimately, that's kind of That's kind of the limiting case of a democracy. It's not going to be a dictatorship.
Excuse me. So it does. So it does hinge on these details. In a sense, you would say that make your own laws is kind of like, say you're giving people a net in which they can collect these detailed suggestions and make them grow into something bigger. Is that kind of the visualization? Is that correct? For the difference that you're making versus today, the status quo?
Well, versus the status quo, I mean, there's a pretty significant difference. The status quo is you have essentially no real representation. You are given the choice between one, maybe two choices of extra value bundles, and you have no effective way to, for instance, vote in the US. I don't know about Germany, but in the US, you can't vote, for instance, for the ability to carry a concealed weapon and for legalizing marijuana. And you can't vote for legalizing marijuana at all in the first place, not through politicians. There's a certain amount of it through voter initiatives. Like that, this is a position that people hold, but you're not able to have that because you have nobody who represents that view, who's likely to get elected. And the way that we have in the U.S., unlike Germany, you guys have a rather more flexible system to enter. My understanding is you only need like 5% of votes to get seats in Parliament. Here
Actually,
you need 51% in some jurisdiction.
Actually,
So it's a lot harder.
Canada, so I don't really know too well how it works in Germany.
I don't remember what Canada has, but you guys
Like
have
Britain.
like 5 effective parties, right? That are not totally teensy like ours.
Really, it really just comes down to the 2 usually. It's kind of like yours. It's very similar.
You don't count the Bloc Québécois?
Yes, you're right. You should count those. So you don't in English Canada, though.
Fair enough. But in the U.S., we don't even have that. We have the Republicans and the Democrats, and nobody else even tries. Because nobody else can get elected because you're wasting your vote. So that is something that we're going to have to co-opt, and it's going to take time. But that's sort of the general problem of liquid democracy. I mean, if you want to talk about liquid democracy versus a republic, I'm happy to do that, but I guess I was taking that aspect of the discussion for granted in this scenario. And I was only trying to contrast my approach versus other approaches to liquid democracy per se. But if you want to talk liquid democracy in principle, I'm happy to do that too.
Well, I think maybe we should probably leave this for later then, because I'm not sure anyone else is interested. I have a feeling, though, that you're not focusing enough on what the individual contributor brings, and you're not identifying that, and you haven't finished your design yet either, so there's still time. You're not identifying that and actually providing tools specifically to that individual to
Like what?
enhance their contribution.
Like what?
Like something would enable them to make a significant difference in the final law. And now you do suggest that they can propose novel details, and that's correct. That's one example of how you would do that. And then you would have to say how your tools are enabling them to do that.
Well, they could also argue for things that they want to support. They could try to get people to support laws that they like or components that they like. They can try to become influential through discussion. Yeah. Sort of like Twitter, except with legal effect. So, is that valuable?
What kind of discussion tool are you providing specifically that enables discussion to actually influence the shape of a law?
That's actually something I have been unsure of. Initially, I was thinking that more of the discussion would be on site, but recently I've thought that maybe that's actually the wrong model, and that the Voting system should be integrated with site, yeah. And policy statements from proxies, or position statements rather, should be on site, and the recommendations and so forth. But I think perhaps it's better for the discussion system as such to actually occur on social networks, so that, for instance, we know you tell us what your Twitter handle is, or your plus handle, or whatever. We track that based on if you include a link of a specific type to the website, or you include specific hashtags that we track, and we tell you what they are, like use these hashtags to make sure that you show up on the discussion of this or whatever. And then we could have commands like, yes or whatever to basically vote using your Twitter account, to vote using your Plus account, to follow someone and say, I proxy to this person who I found on social networks who's registered with the system by their social network ID. I think a lot of that can be offloaded to existing systems. I think that making a good discussion system and good moderation system for comments, take a look at YouTube, etc., is difficult. And I think a lot of the influence actually does occur along social graphs, and that those social graphs can be modified. There's problems with that that concern me. Mainly, they are about filter bubbles. So, for instance, I think it's actually probably a good idea for people to be exposed to stuff that they don't necessarily opt to be exposed to. So, for instance, suppose that we have this AI that I was talking about, where we know approximately where you are in an ideological space, and everybody else. I think that the most beneficial position statements for you to read are not, in fact, the statements by people who agree with you, who are similar to you, nor by the opposition. I think that the best statements for you to read are the statements by people who agree with you on this specific issue and maximally disagree with you on everything else. Why? Because those are the people who are most likely to sort of expand your sense of who is in your in-group, who are people you can relate to reduce the demonization of your opponents, which is, I don't know about Germany, but it's very bad in U.S. political culture. It's really pretty severe. The other group is the exact opposite. People who disagree with you on this particular issue, but are maximally similar to you in all other ways, because those are the people who are most likely to influence you to change your mind. And now notice that neither of these things are, Democrat leaning or, communist leaning or whatever, right? Like, these are just principled things about how do people relate to each other, and how can you get them to have more empathy to each other, or how are they more likely to influence each other's opinions in a meaningful way.
But this is what has already happened on social networks.
The exact opposite happens.
So the discussion happens already, but with no effect. So did I get you right that if you think about, or if you talk about make your law, you talk more about concept than a system or implementation in general?
I don't understand how to interpret your latter. I can think of one way of answering that, but I'm not sure that's what you mean. So could you elaborate?
So what I didn't get from your presentation is if make your laws is more a concept or a system with a concrete implementation.
It is a concrete system that is not coded yet. It is something that I want to make. It is a lot of it is currently in the design phase. So just for instance, a lot of what I've spent the last couple months on is organizational stuff, is legal stuff. I don't know if you saw the email I sent out, but for instance, right now we have a pre-pending advisory opinion request with the FEC, which is the organization in the U.S. that regulates election law, basically all election law.
Okay. So I saw this, and this looks more to me like it's like a startup. So a founded business. And,
well, in certain ways, it's similar to a startup. It's nonprofit. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't, be self-sufficient, and that doesn't mean that it shouldn't, work through the legal system. The other way, of course, to work through the legal system is to be a political party, like you guys do. That's just not the route that I want to take. I think it's way more crippled in the US than it is in a parliamentary system, and it's way more difficult to start, and you can't be neutral as a political party.
Okay, so but I need a second try to get an answer.
Sure.
So what I didn't get is also if you think about Make Your Laws, do you think more about a system which is for discussion or which is for decision?
The two are the same to me. Discussion is part of decision making. There's like how to divide it. So there's the aspect of it which is idea generation, as it were, brainstorming, right? But the thing is, the brainstorming is always going to be backed by votes, right? If someone says, well, I like this idea over this idea in this question, how many votes does that person represent? That's going to be part of it. Similarly, if you're for instance, if we do the thing that I was just talking about, which is sort of punt most of the discussion system to social networks, you would still be executing essentially commands, except that you'd be doing it with a hashtag instead of logging in. So for instance, if you're like, yeah, I totally agree with this proposal that someone else posted, then essentially what you just did is you proxied to them for that proposal. That is a decision command. It is also part of the discussion system. It is also, part of the network of discussion around proposals.
So when you can do it with Twitter, then you can do it anonymously, is it right?
Like I said, I think that people should be allowed to have pseudonymous accounts. The one thing that should not be pseudonymous, the one thing that you must register with your legal identity to get is a vote. To originally get the one vote that you get as a human being, you have to register. If you just want to proxy people's votes, sure, you're welcome to be pseudonymous all you want. You're welcome to be non-human. You can be a party like the Pirate Party. You can be a corporation like ExxonMobil. You can be a non-profit like the ACLU. Those entities, right? They're not humans. They're legal entities, but they don't get a vote. But they could still be proxies. I see no problem with that.
What I didn't get, if you have discussion on Twitter or other platforms, and you agree to some statements on Twitter and to some statements on other platforms, how do you get it all together to one?
Like I said, this is assuming that the central system is monitoring all that. So, for instance, you would register with the central system and say, "This is my user account on Make Your Laws or whatever. This is my Twitter account," and you would tell them, "Okay, we'll start scraping your Twitter account, and if you want us to notice what you've done, you have to either post a link to something on Make Your Laws website." Which is like a policy proposal or something, and you have to use these very specific hashtags, which you tell them exactly what to use. and you just make sure that those are nice and easy to use, and that you can distinguish between what they're writing and what they retweeted or whatever. But you could make it literally as easy as retweeting to proxy to someone. If someone says, for instance, hashtag yes on proposal 20 on MakeYourLaws, whatever, where those things are hashtags and those things are tracked in a way that's systemic, and you retweet that, then we tell you, retweeting that is proxying to them on that action. And the discussion system and simultaneously, if, for instance, if you don't have hashtag yes on it, if you just mention the proposal, then that is discussion, and we will collate those scrapings into a Twitter feed on MakeYourLaws, for instance, or rather a Twitter plus Google plus Facebook plus whatever feed. And yeah, I mean, it's going to be a pain in the ass back end, but it is doable, and I think it's worth a lot of pain in the ass to make it easier for users.
It's awesome.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
It's awesome. I think this
Thank
the
you.
worst problem of other systems is this discussion thing, that it's...
Yeah, that actually, I have to credit a friend of mine who works for Google Plus for that idea. But I thought about it some more, and I think he's really correct on that. And it also makes it so that you don't have to write your own commenting system and so forth. There'd still be moderation issues. People would post stuff that you have to squash. But that's okay. And also, just one point on moderation, unless it's something where it's like illegal or where it's really seriously abusive, something like that, I would say the moderation should all be basically opt out. So we would moderate by default, we would hide it, but you would be able to say, show me all the crazy shit that people post, and you get a fire hose, and it's your problem to deal with if you want that. So not censorship, but moderation. Any other questions? Or comments or holes or whatever? I'll read this long question that someone posted.
I guess you probably mean my question, and I think you already answered it.
Okay.
I think you just have to keep in mind that for us this question is very important, where to assign discussion approach, for example, like yours, because we have in mind that we will deal with the discussion system in a more elaborated way, and so regarding all the presentations we are having now, we constantly ask ourselves where to put the different approaches.
Right, and I actually had the same issue. So I can point you to a post, for instance, if you want, about an idea I had for a commenting system that was based on Reflect, in part. I can just Google that pretty quickly. Here we go. 1 second. Yep. Remove the trailing slash. Sorry about that. But come to think that it's probably wrong, at least for the starting up phase. It might be okay once you're big enough that you have a really established user base, but I think it's actually a pretty good idea to punt a lot of that to the social network so that people can just discuss wherever they're already discussing it. That's the thing. I guess one of the key principles from my view of the design is it should be as close to zero barrier to participation at whatever level of participation someone wants as possible. And it should be as little fragmented as possible. It shouldn't make people, have to get into yet another social network. It should not have the barrier of, for instance, it only works if all of your friends are on it also. Anything like that, you will lose unless you are Google, unless you are Facebook, unless you have that kind of clout. And you don't. The blunt fact is you do not. And we can avoid it, right? We can punt on a lot of that. We can say, okay, for instance, this is one reason why the financial thing is important. We do not have.
May I
Sure.
ask a question? So what you
Go ahead.
what you said already is that only if you are Google Plus or Facebook or whatever, then you have the power to bring your opinion to the front. So and you
That's
said,
not
okay,
what I said.
You said that this is not what we want. So we want that everyone has its voice, possibly.
I said that only if you're Google can you start a new social network. That's a much more narrow thing. That's not about who presents an opinion. That's about the system side of how can you start a system where in order for the system to be useful for you, everybody else has to also be using it. That is a very classic problem in web design. And it's not one that you have enough power to overcome, frankly. I mean, that's something where either you have to be first on something that's really popular, like Yelp, for instance, or you have to have a massive advertising budget, or you have to already be like in everywhere, like Google, where they flip a switch and it's on the Google front page. That'll do it. You don't have any of that.
Then I got your question. Then I got you wrong. But this brings me to the next question. So how can we overcome, or even how get my voice heard on the system?
That's kind of like my question number 2.
I think that's redundant with what we were just talking about with Michael Allen. So I don't know how to answer it differently unless you have a different question.
I'm still interested, although maybe I don't want you to, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but I'm still interested in the specific pathway for that individual contributor who's participating in the discussion to actually affect the content of a law. And you ended by discussing how the system would affect his own mind and what was on it through connecting him with like-minded people or people who disagreed with him and stuff, and how that might change his own views. But I was more interested, and I don't know if this answers, this is what Mark's driving at too, how that one single individual person, what kind of pathway and what kind of tools you provide that would enable him to actually influence the law.
Okay. Well, I'll try to go through them again. I think I've covered them all, but perhaps not clearly enough. So let's see.
Or rather, more specifically, the pick a single pathway for an example, so that you don't. I didn't want you to repeat yourself. I just.
Well, there are several different pathways. So suppose we're talking about. Let's just fix the example so that there's something, and it's a throwaway example, but marijuana legalization. So one method is you upvote the idea. And you just say, yeah, I support this in principle, and I'll trust that the details can be worked out. The next is if there's a finished thing where it's ready to actually be signed legally, you sign it legally, and you contribute, your one signature to the however 100,000 many you need to get it on the ballot. Another is you contribute money, because it's going to need an advertising campaign. It's going to need It's going to need operations budgets. It's going to need all sorts of shit. Frankly, politics requires money. It's unfortunate, but it's true. Another is you can help research the context of the law. You can help research what would be the impacts of some particular policy decision, and help inform people of just the neutral factual background on which they're making a decision. You can help research what is the current state of the law in across many different jurisdictions. This is more an issue for a lawyer, but you could do it if you're not afraid of reading a bunch of law.
Okay, but this is all about contribution, isn't it? So
that's what he was asking.
Yeah, but my question is more regarding to so what I hear from your words is that I need a big group of support to get my voice heard. So otherwise, I can just contribute.
Not to get your individual voice heard, but to pass a law, yeah, you need a big group of support. That's how it works in the U.S. If you want to pass a law and only 10 people support it, you don't get your law. That's kind of a bias that's built into our system, is if there's not enough support, the status quo wins.
Yeah, okay, but for us, the Pirate Party, it's also important what the minority thinks, and that minority has also good ideas and good concepts, which will always overridden by the majority. And do you have an answer to this question?
Yeah, and I would say there are a couple answers, and they address different aspects of it. So first off, a democracy is almost by definition ruled by the majority. And rule by a minority is essentially a plutocracy, which is what we have in the US now. And I think that's not really a healthy democracy. However, you're right that there are important concerns of minorities need to have their voices heard, both in the sense of they might have just ideas that are new that the majority hasn't bothered to think of, or they might be on issues that not as many people care about either way, and that's a thing, sure. And the other aspect is, they might have issues where, for example, something that comes to mind because of friends of mine, several friends of mine are trans, and trans is not something that many people even think about. They don't even consider that there are more genders than just the two, or that people are born into genders that don't match their physical body. And so a lot of the time you will have laws that are written about insurance benefits for mothers, for instance, that just don't even think about the possibility that this might be an issue, right? There it's an issue of the minority needs to be able to make its revisions to get its concerns addressed. They're not really concerns that are in conflict with the majority. It's not like the majority is specifically trying to keep the trans people down. It's just the majority doesn't give a shit either way. So you need ways to do that. And finally, you have the case where the majority is trying to keep them down. So for instance, in the US, we have widespread state-by-state laws and amendments being passed to deprive same-sex couples of any ability to marry or any legal recognition of their partnerships. And that's very explicitly a case where the majority wants to deprive rights of a minority.
Yeah, but I got your idea and your concept in a different way, because you named it MakeYourLaws, and that means to me that's me who makes the law, and
that's
gives
correct.
Me the chance to make it, and not just to to participate and to contribute, but have more
Well,
power on that.
I mean, you don't get to. It's so make your laws in the sense in the collaborative, contributive sense. You don't get to be a dictator. Sorry. If you want to be a dictator, go Seastead or something, where you can be just, you can dictate your own laws because you're in command of your own territory. But
Okay,
so
no,
long
I
as you're
don't-
living
I don't
with other
want
people,
to
you don't get
dictate
to.
it. I don't want to dictate it, so don't get
Then-
me wrong. But I want to get the minority heard.
I do too. So I was just laying out the different aspects of a minority problem before I address how you solve those things, just because I think they're fairly different kinds of problems. So if it's a case where the minority could patch problems with the law by just changing some components in ways that the majority would not really care about either way, that would be very easy for them to do in this kind of componentized system. In any given component, you only need majority agreement among the people who participate in that in voting on that discussion, and only among exclusive options. So if you want to add something that other people are not opposed to and nobody's voting against it, and it patches some issue with, say, trans rights, great, there's no problem there. The second problem is there is a conflict. And that's actually where, someone mentioned that I'm trying to use the system to shape how people think. And yes, that's actually true to some extent. One of the main ways that you protect the rights of minorities is by making sure that people can empathize with them, that people can listen to them in a real way. And that's going to be part of it. However, people will pass laws that abridge their rights. And at that point, you have to have non-democratic systems. In the US, we have a judicial system where the executive, judicial, and legislative branches are separate branches. And if, for instance, and this happens in the US, right? If some city council wants to pass a law that says no mosques are allowed in this city, they can pass that law. But it'll immediately get challenged in court. And it'll get stricken down because we have a constitution and the First Amendment protects exactly this kind of right. And if you really, really, really want to ban mosques, you can do that if you're willing to first overturn the First Amendment. No one's willing to do that, though. So if you're talking hard protections for minorities, it comes down to commitments through constitutions or similar things to rights that you do not let yourself abridge. Rights that you take away from the democratic legislature, invest in a judiciary, and say, if we get drunk and bigoted one night, don't let us do that. Unless we, surmount this much higher hurdle. If you're talking a softer approach, then it is about nudges in the discussion system. It is about, how can you make it so that people are less dichotomized, are less, less view each other as total opposites, and see each other as people that they can negotiate with. And you can also do this in subtle ways. Like, for example, you can promote ideas based on not necessarily just, how many people support it in total, like the raw number, but what proportion of people who have expressed an opinion on this support it. And that way you can say, the laws where people have more consensus will get more attention. And that will just implicitly nudge people to try to get more consensus. There are lots of ways you can nudge a system, but you're not going to get a hard answer of, how do we protect the rights of minorities when the majority is trying to deprive them? You don't within a legislature, and you cannot. It's just not possible. That is what an independent judiciary is for.
Okay, thank you for now. Okay, so I think yeah, the time is it's 11 p.m. 20 after. So yeah, what I want to ask if there are any other questions. So otherwise, I would like to come to an end for today. And what I also want to ask is if there's somebody else who wants to present his ideas or concept next time.
I don't think that I'm gonna manage to present it next time, but maybe the week after.
So that would be a presentation of adhocracy?
Not autocracy, an own idea.
Okay.
But this is a good topic point. I guess it's really important for us to set up a schedule so that we can know so that we not only look what is the next sessions, but that we really have a plan for the session next to the session. I think you know what I mean.
Okay, so you think it's to have it more structured?
Yeah, for instance, the question is how one could set up such a schedule.
Okay.
So we need someone to present every week. So who is going to do that for the next week, and who is going to do that for the week after the next week, and so on.
Yeah, so we can also do it in a loose term, so it don't needs to be each week. Okay, but just one question to say. Are you satisfied with this evening?
There was one question that was mentioned on the Pirate Pad, and I don't think we mentioned it at all, and I think it's actually kind of important, which is the Tea Party comment. So first I would say that the Tea Party is part of my intended user group. These are people with whom I personally often will disagree on their policy preferences, but much like the Occupy people, they actually often have a sense that they're not participating enough and that they want more of an influence on government, and I think that's actually something to encourage. However, the one thing that it touches on there is lying in political speech, and I do think that a good, healthy system actually has to do fact-checking, but it has to do so in as close as possible to a neutral way, because fact-checking is basically only useful to people who trust you and who trust you to disagree with them, even. So it's an interesting issue. It's probably not something we have enough time to discuss, but the question of how do you make a fact-checking system so that people can trust it even when they might really disagree with it, and especially I don't know again about what your political culture is in Germany, but in the US it's very, very highly politicized. And you need to avoid the appearance that the system is biased one way or another. You need to avoid it looking like the platform itself has an opinion on something like whether the US should subsidize corn or whatever. That's something that the platform has to be absolutely neutral about. But provide reliable information on. So, and yes, the Tea Party is very conservative. You are going to have very conservative people using this tool, and they are your users just like anybody else, and they need to be respected just as much as anyone else, even if you don't like them. Especially if you don't like them, actually.
Okay, and there's also a question in line 76 now. Is there something to say?
I didn't really understand the cucumber reference. I mean, I guess this is just saying, you know, what is an approach to work things out? The answer is it's going to take or a lot of organizational bootstrapping. It's not naively that I have said that our first priority is U.S. state level rather than local level. I have very seriously given consideration to local level. It turns out that it's actually a lot more difficult to operate locally because of two things. One is you need enough people in any given jurisdiction to pass something. Yes, there's fewer of them that you need in, you know, some city or county, but also you have access to fewer people. It's harder to just bootstrap that critical mass. The second thing is regulation-wise, you have to follow all of the regulations, both local and state and national. So, I mean, it's just accretive. Yes, I ultimately want to do that, but it's going to take trying.
I was more thinking that cucumber tests are something you can read and you can see that I'm going to address this issue of bringing up a law for my state level. That's what you're working on. Mm-hmm. And other people may be more interested in, I want to have a very good discussion method which will allow multiple levels of voting. Say you get 10 votes, they vote across 3 issues or whatever. You know, it's a little different issues. And I think in the end, we're going to have to mix and match a lot of different things. So it might be nice to have some of these areas just written out, not so much as like this is a project, but we need to address.
Do you mean for users or for developers?
I mean more for, it would be more from the user's point of view, but as developers, we should stay aware of, are we addressing those issues?
I agree, and I would say just that that's actually a very difficult proposition. And
I agree. I mean, it might be the first case we need the discussion group.
Well, actually, what you need to answer this is a lot of knowledge of campaign finance law, voter law, signature law, etc. And I'm gaining that, but for one, it's hard to even collate, and for two, it's hard to convey to someone short of them doing almost the same amount of effort. So I can say I personally know a lot about federal campaign finance law and California campaign finance law, and not a whole lot about Vermont law. And basically nothing about city and county law, and they all are accretive. They all add to each other. So if you're talking, you know, what are the steps that are required to literally to like get something on the ballot? What signatures are accepted? Who's allowed to give money to whom? These are all detailed legal questions. They're not a priori questions, unfortunately. The law is not nearly as logical as I would like it to be. It's what it is. And
no, absolutely not. You're right. And I think of those things that you just mentioned more as like a really detailed level. I'm actually thinking more towards what Mike Lallen was talking about, is like, how do I influence something? I have an idea for a law. What can I do? So those scenarios would be spelled out that you can do this or you can do that. Not so much that the detail level we have to know as hackers of like how to get a new party started.
Yeah. It's going to be funny because we're gonna have basically finite state machines representing the actual flow of a law through Congress, and I'm guessing it's not going to be all that similar to what they do on Schoolhouse Rocks. If only. How exactly it works, if you're talking from a user perspective, I mean, I can give you an idealized version, but it would ultimately need to be completely rewritten for a given system. I can give you right now the overview, which is...
I get what you're doing. I think I'm actually, it's a marketing question almost. It's like, no matter how beautiful a thing we develop, it has to be appeal to people to get enough people on the system to make any difference at all.
Well, that's actually one thing that I don't know if you were here when I was talking about what are my assumptions in, you know, what is permissible for us to assume. One of the assumptions is I'm not willing to block on things, and I'm not willing to do something where you have to have a critical mass before you have any power. That's really, really deeply problematic to me.
No, I'm not even suggesting that. That's not a startup way of doing things. It's just like for the future, you want to make sure you can get some market so you can go from 1,000 to 100,000.
Sure, and actually that's part of why I started with the money side of things. It's not just because, you know, we could use some operating funds, though that's also true. It's also because the amount of money you contribute to it is something that can scale easily. You don't have to have a fully fleshed out proposal to give, you know, $5 to a Kickstarter for some proposition that you think is cool, but can only work if people give it $50,000 because that's how much it takes to get it off the ground. You don't need to be the only source of signatures for something for us to have a system where you can, if you want, sign any ballot initiative that's available, and contribute your, you know, however many signatures that you manage to collect.
Yeah, and what you just said would be one of those perfect things to have down. It's not a cucumber test, but it's like a bullet point, you know?
Oh, I see. I don't know how to write it down. It's all in my head right now, which is bad, I realize. And let me put it this way: if you're interested in working together, I'm very much likewise. And what I write down is a big function of, you know, who I'm working with and like what I need to explain to people. So email me is probably best, or ping me on IM. All my contact info is on sci-fi.com. And yeah, if anything's not clear, that's general case, I would want it to be on the MakeYourLaws website. If it's more specific to, you know, how do we code this or whatever, then those are discussions that we've been having mostly in the Google Plus group.
Yeah, that's where I've been hanging. Okay, got it.
But I think your point is really actually quite important, which is it needs to scale gradually. We're not going to start out with 1 million users, and we're not going to get 1 million users if it requires 1 million users to have. So it needs to be something where it is useful, perhaps not as powerful, obviously, but is still useful if you only have 10 people, if you only have 100 people, so that it can grow organically. And I think that those two mechanisms, signing petitions and campaign finance in a democratized way, those are methods that are possible to do.
That's perfect. That's almost like the perfect couple top lines in a marketing piece for this.
Good. I am not a great marketer, I will admit that. Ramfara, please stop spamming. That's annoying, and you're making me want to mute you. And also, just to be clear, because I guess it matters to you, I am not a member of the Pirate Party. I am a hacker. I am not a member of whatever organization needs to certify me as being a hacker. Fuck that. I have spoken at 2 CCCs before. It would have been 3, except Gmail thought that my invite for the third one wasn't important enough to show me. And so I found out from Henrik after the fact, unfortunately. So for what it's worth, I've submitted a talk on MakeYourLaws and other issues to the next CCC. And if you guys are interested in hearing me talk about this and related issues, or talking in person, hint, hint. Yeah, I would love to give another talk at CCC. What am I doing here? I'm talking about MakeYourLaws.org.
Okay, so ignore Raumfahrer, and yeah, it's another thing of which systems must resist.
Moderation. Just like
Yes.
the guy last week who was ranting about, I forget what, some random pseudo historian who is neo-Nazi and a Holocaust denialist, and how like this historian was getting suppressed by the man. We eventually just muted him.
Okay, that's a good idea. Okay, so for me, time is over now. I like to thank you for your presentation. I enjoyed it very much, and I got some new impressions. And
Thank you much for having me.
Yeah, but I didn't get anything. But I think maybe we can. Are you aware of our working group having some kind of framework to describe, and maybe we can stay in touch with this idea, and
I'd be happy to.
And so
for what it's worth, I do think that the policy discussion system is sort of a generalized case of the more specific thing which you're trying to do within the Pirate Party, which is you're trying to have discussion among a more narrow group. But that's really just a specialized case, and I think we can use the exact same tools.
Yeah, there's a lot of things which are different, I think, and there are a lot of things which are common. And so we should focus on the things which are common, and then we can see where we can work together, or where we can define some general APIs. So this is my topic, to have some general APIs to combine all the systems to interact and connect to each other and exchange data.
Oh,
so
hey, the wiki's back up.
Okay, so for me it's time to leave.
Okay.
I want to say thank you, and to all participants for today, and hopefully hear you next week, or even we have to decide which is the next talk, and we can do this via email, and then we will read, we will hear, we will see. Okay, so
great.
That's for now. See you. Bye.
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 I'd also like to thank you very much for your presentation, Zai.
Thank you for having me. I only found about you guys a couple of weeks ago from Christoph Pupp. So it was very enjoyable to talk with you, and I should point out I'm very happy to get criticism, constructive criticism preferably. People have raised issues that are sort of security issues that I think are very interesting and actually kind of difficult to address. Most issues that people have raised are ones that are meet my standard, which is basically I'm not trying to make a perfect system. I'm trying to make something that is no worse than the current one, and preferably significantly better. Yeah, most things it passes that. There's one attack that's thought of and raised that is no worse than a system where everybody has a write-in ballot, which is the abusive husband scenario. And that's basically because if the husband is basically shoulder surfing their wife all the time and forcing them to vote a specific way, then you basically have lost authentication. And that's pretty difficult to deal with, short of a private voting booth. But pretty much everything else, as far as I know, is better under this than what we have now. But I'm open to attacks.
And we as well. I guess now would be a good moment to stop the recording. So I'm going to end it now. Just to inform you how long it lasted this time. This time it lasted 2 hours, 2.5 hours.
Joy.